In this video, I'll demonstrate how you can obtain a Google Access token that you can use to securely communicate with Google APIs. On the front end, I'll use Angular and the Google Identity Services JavaScript library, while on the back end, I will use Spring Boot and the Google API client library. All right, so the first thing we need to do is set up the Google API client credentials in Google Console. So I do that by clicking Create Credentials, and I want the auth client ID. Application type is a web application because it's going to be in the browser. Say 215, and it's going to be running on port on localhost first of all, and port 4201. And then the authorized redirect URI is going to be 4201 as well, because I'm going to be using pop-up version of the Google Auth screen. So URI here, create, that's done. Now let's move to the front end code. So here we'll need to load the Google Authorization JavaScript library. What you're looking at here is my Angular front end code. I have a project that exists already, and I'm in the index.html file. We need to load the JavaScript library on any page where a user might load OAuth2 codes or tokens. So we'll put this in the index.html file. And what we need to do is add this script, which references a GSI client library. I need to configure the logic that fetches the Google authorization code, and I do that in this Google Auth component. At the very top, I declare a constant called Google. This is a global variable that's available at runtime that allows me to access the JavaScript library in Angular. So this library that you declared here, I'm now able to reference its APIs using Angular syntax. So that's what this variable does. I also have an access token, which we're going to store the token that we eventually receive. Then I have a client, which will store the Google client that we'll be using to make the calls. I have this Google Auth service that I declared in the constructor, and this is responsible for exchanging the code that we receive for a token. So it will send a call to the backend with the code and receive an access token in response. Here we have the onInit function, and this is essentially initializing the Google client that we're going to use. We already have a client ID in the Google Cloud Console, so let me fetch that. So here it is, the client, so I'll copy that, come back here and paste it in my environment. And here I'll use that Google Client ID. So now I've referenced the Google Client ID and assigned it to this parameter here. I want the access token that I receive to have permission to read Gmail messages. To do that, I need to define a scope that will give that token those permissions. Right now, the scope is empty, but I can grab the scope that I want by going into the Gmail API documentation. Here we have the Gmail API scopes documentation, and if I scroll down, this is what I want. So I'll copy this, come back here and paste it. There are two types of UX modes, pop-up and redirect. In redirect mode, you host an endpoint on your server, and Google will send the authorization code to that endpoint. Whereas in pop-up mode, you simply declare a callback method like I have here, and then that callback is responsible for sending the code to the endpoint. In the browser, we're going to have a link which, when clicked, is going to cause a Google sign-in pop-up to display. When the user enters their username and password and they're authenticated successfully, Google is going to fetch the authorization code for us. Here we see what that looks like. Just a basic link element, an A element, and the label is going to be sign in with Google. It has a click handler here, which is this function. And that basically just calls the request code function on the Google client. When Google sends back the authorization code from this request, it's going to be handled by the callback handler here that we have, which is this function. Okay, given what we have set up so far, let's see what it looks like in a browser. So let me just navigate to localhost 4201, sign in with Google, I have my account here, and oops, access is denied. My access has been blocked because my project has not completed the Google verification process. This app is being tested currently, which is what I'm doing, and can only be accessed by developer approved testers. So I think I forgot one thing. I need to go into the Google Cloud Console and add this account, this email, as a tester. Then I'll come back and log in and let's see what happens. Okay, back in Google Cloud Console, go to auth consent screen and test users. So let me add this email. Save. All right, shows up. Now if I come back here, sign in with Google. Okay, so the message went away, but now it's just giving me as a user notice that this app has not been verified, which is fine. This is just a demo. Continue. All right, so here's the permissions I'm seeking. View your email messages and settings. Continue. Let me check the browser console and see if there are any errors or messages there. If I come to the console tab, we see that there's a cause error here, and this is expected because I have not yet finished setting up my backend. So it looks like I received the authorization code from Google, but when it tries to send it to my backend to exchange the code for an access token, it gets this cause error, and this is expected. But once I finish setting up my backend server, this error should go away. All right, so this is a backend server. It's written in Spring Boot. And here what you're looking at is my cause config. So I have configured my backend to accept requests from my front end, which is running on localhost 4201. So this should get rid of that cause error that we saw earlier. The endpoint that my front end is going to be sending the Google authorization code to is defined in this Google Auth controller. And this is just a standard Spring Boot endpoint. The path for the endpoint is v1/auth/exchange code, and it's a post request. And the post request has the code as a request parameter. And we also have a CSRF check here to check if the request passes the cross-site request forgery check. The details of the CSRF are beyond the scope of this tutorial, but you can look it up. It's basically a way of securing your endpoint. So here I'm just doing a basic check that checks to see that the presence of a certain custom header that I set in the front end. If that header is present, then it passes a check. And then once it passes a check, it forwards the code to this Google Auth service that I wrote in here. This exchange code for token method makes use of the Google API client libraries, which I included in my project by adding them to my build.gradle here, Google API client version 2.7.1. Now that gives me access to classes such as this one, the Google authorization code token request, and I pass in certain arguments to it. So the first one is this net HTTP transport object. The next one is it requires some type of JSON factory. So I'm using JSON and I'm using the default instance from that JSON factory. It also requires a token server URL. And this is the URL that I'm going to send the code to. And in return, it's going to give me an access token. It's the Google API token URL. Then I have this Google Client ID and Google Client Secret. These are defined in my Google Cloud Console that I created earlier. And then in my application, I declare them as environment variables here so that I'm not storing the credentials, which are sensitive in the code. So these are on my machine. So this demo Google Client ID and demo Google Client Secret are environment variables on my laptop. And then I reference them or assign them to these Spring Boot properties here. And then from there, I'm able to call them in this class. The code here is the code that I get from the front end. And then this redirect URI is what I created in the Google Cloud Console as my redirect URI. So that has to match what is here. So this and the one in the Google Cloud Console must be identical, otherwise the request will fail. Then from there, I call execute, and I get a token response, which has, among other things, the access token, the refresh token, and when the token expires in seconds. Now that I've shown you what goes on in the backend, let me show you the front end code that sends the request to the backend to get the token. So remember, in this Google client initialization, I had this callback parameter, and I defined this handle auth code response function as my callback handler. So when the code comes back, it gets sent to this function. And then I call this get access token using auth code function, which is what makes a call to the backend. So this consists of two items here. So it has the headers and the body. So the headers consist of the content type, which is of type X, www, form URL encoded, and then the custom header for my CSRF check on the backend. It also has this body here, which has the code encoded and then assigned to this variable here called code. So both these are passed to the request, and the request of post request that's sent to the backend. And when the response comes back, it's converted to this token object. And this token object has the same fields as the one in the backend. So in the backend, I have a similar token that has an access token field, an expires in seconds field, and a refresh token field. So here, here, and here. So those two match. So this is what is sent from the backend, and the front end receives it, receives the response here and converts it to this token, this TypeScript token. And so now from here, I'm able to display the access token, because that token that comes from the backend gets assigned. So you see it's reference here, token, and then I get the access token and assign it to this variable in my component. And this is bound to the HTML. And in my HTML, I just have a simple display that displays the access token when it's returned. So let's go ahead and demo this, and hopefully it should work from beginning to end now that I have everything set up. Okay, now let's do this from beginning to end and see how it goes. So when I click on this, the pop-up shows up, and since I'd signed in already, I don't need to sign in again. I just click on that, choose the account, click on continue. Same thing here, click on continue, and voila, here's the access token that I got from the backend. So right now I'm only displaying the access token in the front end, but the token response from the backend has other properties or other values that I want to display. One of them is a refresh token, and the other is expires in seconds duration. So let me just add that for completeness. So we have the refresh token string, and then they say expires in seconds. So here I'll just add that. And come here, say refresh. Okay, so if I come back here, let's go through the same cycle again, continue, and we can see the values are now displayed. That brings us to the end of this video. The aim of this tutorial was to demonstrate how we can leverage Google's authorization services to get an access token that has API permissions. In my case, my access token is scoped to Gmail read-only. In a future video, I'm going to show how I can use this token to actually fetch messages from Gmail. Thank you for watching.